You've been to Syria recently and you visited President Bashar Assad and you had a good follow-up on the situation there. How do you describe the situation in Syria at the moment?
I'm very optimistic about it. There's a tremendous amount of very serious combat taking place, but the Russians they've been staunch allies. Even though at one point they said they were going to draw down their forces, when it looked necessary, they came right back in and they're there strong. I think right now there are some very, very significant battles. Of course, Aleppo is always the major prize in the war, and I know that things are building up there. There has been activity around Raqqa, trying to recover the air base nearby there. It's a question of where do you put your chess pieces on the board.
It looks like you are betting more on the military solution rather than on a political one, unlike what the United Nations, for example, is saying. Why is that?
Well, the Geneva talks are a sham. Those are not going to go anywhere. To some extent, they've been used to provide cover for Arar al-Sham and for other terrorist organizations to move troops around. I have very little confidence. And if you look at it, the head of the Syrian delegation is, it has a very sinister background. So these are not people who are looking for
You
peace.
mean from the opposition side?
The opposition. Yeah. And of course the United States sits there with Saudi Arabia on one side and Turkey on the other side. It's like having a tarantula in one hand and a scorpion in the other.
How do you describe the Saudi role in this context, since they control the delegation, the Riyadh delegation, which goes for the Geneva negotiations?
Yes. Well, Turkey and Saudi Arabia formed the Army of Conquest, and it's formed around Al-Qaeda, which is al-Nusra, and it is extraordinarily radical and violent. Even the name, the Army of Conquest, does that sound like a democratic organization to you? Of course not. Yeah. It's about conquest. It's about defeating the Syrian people and destroying Syria. This is the objective of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the #1 sponsor of global terrorism today, by far. And the media keeps saying, oh, Iran is. I can't name a terrorist event that Iran has been responsible for in decades. But I can rattle off any number with Saudi Arabia. Everything from San Bernardino to the Boston massacre to Brussels to Paris, all over the world, and of course, obviously, the terrorism that they have foisted on Syria is.
So you mean they can't play a positive role in bringing about a political solution to the Syrian crisis?
No, Saudi Arabia, it is an utterly corrupt, decadent dictatorship. They have nothing positive to offer the world, nothing. This country is so depraved, and it's interesting. I talked to a stewardess on a flight, and she said, you know what? She said the Saudis come onto the plane, and the women, they're all dressed in the black, the burqas and so forth, and then they go into the ladies' room and they come out and they're all dressed sexy with makeup, and they're ready to go party, and they're ready to get the drugs and the alcohol and all of the other things. And so it's a corrupt dictatorship there, and they beheaded 47 people in a single day.
Yeah, but this is not the main story in the U.S. Why is it? I mean, they are considered as major allies to the United States, and they really get the best reception and best audience from the American media. Why is this duplicity?
It's money. Okay? I call it Mr. Green. Mr. Green comes and visits politicians, and the politicians are very receptive. They like Mr. Green. He brings them the cash, and they do his bidding. And now,
Is there any change in the public opinion here with regard to the crisis? Is there a different reading after 6 years of fighting there? Are people trying to change their point of view here?
there is. When I wrote the letter to President Assad in 2014, it caused an earthquake all around the world, and media sources everywhere were criticizing it. How could you possibly write to President Assad? And I said, look, I've said two things. Thank you for the gallant victory on the Kalaman mountain range where you have rescued all of the Christians. And of course I knew not only Christians, but many people were captured there. I said, and the other thing, I cannot explain to you why the United States, which lost 3,000 people to Al-Qaeda in the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on 9/11, has now gone full circle, and we are supporting and supplying Al-Qaeda in Syria. And it began a process no one had questioned before, and all of a sudden people began to question, and they said, well, can this really be true? Why is he saying this? And so the foreign policy intellectuals began to question the government's position, not only in the United States, but in Britain and France and different places. And I think since then, there's been a steady erosion of support for the war in Syria. And I think recently the Brexit, where Britain voted to go out of the European Union. Of course, the European Union has been very supportive of war against Syria, and all of a sudden they have been weakened. And Great Britain was one of the key players in trying to bring down Syria, and all of a sudden they're going to have to focus on their internal affairs.
This is something I wanted to ask you about. It looks you are optimistic about the Brexit that will have a positive effect on the war in Syria. Another thing is the refugee crisis. How do you see it evolving?
Well, the refugee crisis is very complex because you and I know Syrians are wonderful people. They're just the most wonderful people you could imagine. But these so-called refugees are not Syrians. They're Afghans, they're Pakistanis, they're jihadists that have been organized by Turkey to infiltrate Europe. And Saudi Arabia has said, well, we can't possibly take any refugees, but we'll build 200 Wahhabi mosques to preach the most vile and violent and vicious things to these people when they arrive there. So it's a Trojan horse. It's not a real refugee.
But it has some ramifications on the policymakers because of the pressure is too high on Europe, as well as it is a controversial issue in the United States in the presidential election. So how would this impact on the politics of the region and on the war there?
Well, in an odd sort of way, I think it is helpful because I'm not sure that the Brexit would have occurred without the so-called Syrian refugees. There was a backlash, and I think that certainly tipped the balance. So that was a very positive thing. In this country, it's very confused because people still think that the Syrian refugees are from Syria. Some of them are. Some of them are selected by the Muslim. Some of them from the Muslim Brotherhood. They say, okay, you're good to go. But when you see the pictures of the Syrian refugees, you don't see the grandmother, the children, the wife. You see military-age jihadists going there with a hatred of Europe that's inbred by the Wahhabi mosques. And so on on balance, you put all of that together, and I think it's undermining the war against Syria. The forces that are fighting against Syria, I think, are weakened by all of this.
Senator Black, thank you very much for this interview with Al Mayadeen.
Thank you, and I have a great admiration for Al Mayadeen.
Thank you.
It is one of the most reliable sources in the Middle East.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nizar. I'm sorry, man.